What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we're going to be doing a speed test comparison between three of Samsung's budget A series devices, the A12, the A22 5G, and the A32 5G. Now, the reason I chose these phones, aside from being one after another in the A series lineup, is because price-wise, these phones are pretty close. Spec-wise, it's really tough to tell them apart, and if you're in the market for a $200 to $300 device, and performance is the most important thing to you, I think a real-world side-by-side comparison test like this can be super helpful. We're going to go ahead and see how these phones stack up with everyday Android apps, third-party apps, gaming, and a whole lot more. Before we get into all that though, I just want to briefly go over the specs of each device so we know what we're working with, but if you aren't interested in that, feel free to just jump ahead to the actual speed test. So with the A12, this phone is powered by the MediaTek Helio P35 chipset. Mine also has 4 gigs of RAM and 64 gigs of internal storage, but all of these phones can be spec'd a little differently with the RAM and storage, so keep that in mind. The A22 5G here has the MediaTek Dimensity 700 5G chipset inside, 6 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of storage, and lastly, the A32 5G packs the MediaTek Dimensity 720 5G chipset and the same 6 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of storage. I think with the specs, you can already see why a real-world speed test would be valuable. All three phones have MediaTek processors, so that's the first thing worth comparing. And you'll also get a good idea of 4 versus 6 gigs of RAM as well with the A12. Now, here are the Geekbench scores for each one of these devices. This gives us sort of a numeric value of specs and performance to compare right off the bat. And this, I think, sort of hints at the theme of this speed test. The A12 is pretty far behind the A22 5G and A32 5G, which in turn I think are actually a lot closer together than I expected. Now, each one of these phones was set up in the exact same way, with the same apps installed on every page. All the apps have been set up the same way as well, which you'll see. The batteries are charged up to 100%. I just try and make these tests as fair and straightforward as possible. On the software side of things, everything has also been updated to the latest version of Android and One UI Core for all three of these phones. Under the device care page here, you can confirm the storage and the RAM that I mentioned earlier. The device optimization is 100% as well. It's all as even as I can make it. But one last thing to quickly mention, the A22 5G also has an extra feature that the other two phones don't have, a high refresh rate 90 Hz display. And for this test, I'm going to just leave that enabled because I want you to see if and when that higher quality display makes a difference with taps, touches, swipes, and anything else. It won't affect load times for apps or anything like that, but for interacting with the device, I think the A22 5G will look more fluid and responsive, and perhaps that's a feature you might want on your smartphone, and it could be a big reason in choosing the A22 5G already. So to start this speed test off, I want to just quickly go through the general Android UI and default Android and Samsung apps, because I think in average day-to-day use, a lot of this stuff is what you'll probably interact with. And what you'll find here is that I think the A22 5G and A32 5G are almost identical in launching and loading apps, but the A12 usually takes about a split second or so to bring stuff up. And it doesn't really matter if it's like the full app or just a menu item or if it's switching between pages. Almost always, the A12 is going to take that extra little bit of time to bring up pretty much everything you'll see on screen. Now, this isn't really a big deal in my opinion, and if you didn't have these phones side by side, you might not even notice or care about the A12's little delay. Performance-wise, once you're actually in the app, there's really no issues there, and that's more important, I think. And to be completely honest, if texting, phone calls, web browsing, and light social media use are all you're going to do with your phone anyway, then getting something like the A12 and saving a bit of money really isn't a bad move in this case. Comparatively, like I've said in previous videos, you don't necessarily get as noticeable of a difference in spending more money here if you aren't pushing your phones too hard anyway. Price-wise, the A12 is like a $180 phone, while the A22 5G and A32 5G are $250 or more. And that's kind of a considerable price difference at these price points. That's some 30% cost difference. And you can see here that you're probably not getting a 30% better phone if you aren't going to push the devices too hard. And when we get into like Twitter and Instagram and YouTube, these popular apps are pretty well optimized too for even the budget devices. So you're not really going to see much of a difference in performance here either. All in all, this I think is where these budget phones really shine. And for most people, any one of these devices is going to be more more than enough. But the A12, in this case, I think offers considerable amount of value. Also, just as a quick side note, the difference between 4 and 6 gigs of RAM here also doesn't appear to be a game changer yet. You can see that all three of these phones switch between apps perfectly fine. Most everything stays loaded up. Yes, the A12 takes another second or so to bring up the app sometimes. You're still going to see that, but with 10 or 15 apps loaded up, so long as it's nothing too crazy, all three of these phones keep up pretty nicely. And there's no real disadvantage with the A12 yet. However, when we jump into some bigger graphics-heavy apps like these games, this is where the A12 suddenly falls way behind. Now, for these first few games, I also kept all the other apps we previously launched open and running in the background, and you'll see here in real time that suddenly the A12 is significantly slower than the A22 5G and A32 5G. And this, I think, has to do with a couple of things. First off, processor-wise, the A12's chipset is significantly less powerful than the other two phones. We saw that with the Geekbench scores at the beginning, and when it comes to these bigger, more intense, graphics-heavy apps, that's where it's going to start to choke up a bit more, at least with the initial launch and load times. Furthermore, while 4 gigs of RAM is plenty to keep a dozen Android and social media apps current, suddenly those 4 gigs aren't quite enough to also handle a big, huge game trying to load up either. Having only 2 extra gigs of RAM doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're comparing 4 and 6 gigs, that really is a big difference. And as we load up more and more games, the A12 just gets slower and slower. Now, fortunately, when you do finally jump into the game itself, performance-wise, the A12 can play the games just fine. You're not at any disadvantage at all, even for online play, and there's no real lag or latency or any kind of frame drop or anything like that I've personally seen. So that's great, and if you have the patience to just sort of wait out those initial couple minutes of load times, then you'll still enjoy playing the games once you're finally in them. But I think out of everything, this is where the big difference lies between the A12 and the other two devices in this side-by-side test. If gaming specifically is your thing, it just kind of makes way more sense to spend the extra money and jump to at least the A22 5G for sure. You'll see here too that with these last couple of games, I ended up just quitting all the other apps that were running in the background to try and help out the A12 a bit more in that initial launch time. But even in attempting to just load the one game, the one app, and nothing else, it's still a minute or two sometimes behind the A22 5G and A32 5G. So out of everything, I think this is where the difference lies, and this is where you'll kind of need to decide if you're going to be gaming heavily, if you utilize a lot of graphics intense apps, if you just aren't willing to wait a minute or two to get into that game. If that's the case, then the A22 5G or A32 5G are really worth that extra investment. And speaking on those two phones now in particular, just to finish up, what's sort of interesting is that while the speed and performance are similar, the A22 5G with its 90 Hz display actually makes that phone more enticing in my opinion. I don't think the 720 5G chipset in the A32 5G is that much better than the 700 5G chipset in the A22 5G. And I'd rather have a high refresh rate display anyway, regardless of those spec differences. So out of everything here, looking beyond just the side-by-side performance, I do think the A22 5G is probably what I would choose in the end. Also, if you're curious about the battery longevity, here's where these three phones were sitting after about an hour of flipping through all of these apps. They each have a 5,000 milliamp battery inside, so capacity-wise, it's all the same. And interestingly enough, they seem to drain at a similar rate too. Obviously, there's a lot more factors to consider, but I thought that was at least something interesting to point out. So there you go. Hopefully this speed test and side-by-side comparison was somewhat helpful. In general, the A12 is a great phone if you keep your usage simple, but jumping to the A22 5G or A32 5G is really worth it if gaming is your thing. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to know your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.